And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
This is a default impression of Ghana's Independence Day. The image of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah with his comrades of the Socialist Convention People's Party on the podium. Osagyefo declaring, "The battle has ended. Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." To the left, Komla Bidima, Nathaniel Welbeck, and Archie Casey Hayford. To the right, Kojo Botio and Krobo Edusei. These images are so burned into our shared consciousness, they have practically lost the weight of their true significance. As the national anthem played officially for the first time, keen observers might notice a quick gesture as Dr. Kwame Nkrumah dabs his eyes with a hanky, overwhelmed with emotion. That simple gesture represents a glimpse into the true weight of the scenes we are witnessing from so many decades ago. You see, in spite of what we might think about our freedom today, independence of the first black African nation was a struggle. For 9 long years, sovereignty was fought over, postponed, and resisted. The greatest conflict in history, World War II, had ended. Soldiers from the Gold Coast had fought for the British Empire in Burma, going up against Imperial Japan and facing the full brunt of that bloody conflict. Now, 3 years later, many have only been paid a third of what they are owed by the colonial government. On 28 February 1948, 2,000 veterans marched on the Christiansborg Castle, the seat of colonial power located in Osu. They get to the crossroad leading to the castle. In front of them, a line of 12 policemen stand in their way.
The crowd in front were very close, perhaps 20, 25 yards, I don't know. I gave the order to fire, and nothing happened at all. We were obviously going to get overrun at any moment, and I retreated back onto the firing party and tore a rifle out of the hands of one of the men, and I myself fired at a man in front who was urging the crowd forward, and he was killed, and I think I fired a total of another 5 shots, and the crowd turned around and made off.
The police superintendent, Colin Imrie, orders his men to fire on the crowd of African veterans. His men do not respond. Imrie alone seizes a rifle from one of his men and fires 6 shots into the crowd, killing 3 people: Sergeant Cornelius Frederick Ajete, Private Odate Lamte, and Corporal Atipo. About 30 others are injured. The crowd quickly disperses. By nightfall, riots break out across Accra. Cars are overturned, British and foreign businesses are ransacked. By the following day, riots rage across the entire Gold Coast territories. The colonial government believes members of the political activist group, the United Gold Coast Convention, or UGCC, are responsible for the riots. Earlier in the month, the UGCC had organized a strike on goods brought in by the Association of West African Merchants, AWAM, who are European importers. The strike was meant to force the association to lower its exorbitant prices and break their monopoly. The riots coincide with the date the boycotts are to have ended. The 6 leaders of the UGCC are arrested and incarcerated together in the northern territories of the Gold Coast. On their arrest, they are captured in this famous picture. Kwame Nkrumah, the secretary of the UGCC, on the left, and the 5 founding members, Emmanuel Obechibi Lamte, Ebenezer Akua-Adjei, William Oforiatta, Joseph Boachi Dankwa, and Edward Akufo-Addo. The image captivates the imagination of the Gold Coast public. The 6 are seen as patriots in what starts to be considered a nationwide struggle for self-rule.
We were not expecting to be arrested. but we were arrested, and we weren't very angry because they came and said, well, we don't really know whether you are the cause of it, but your presence here does not seem to conduce to peace, so we'll take you away.
Following a war touted by the Western Allies to have been fought for freedom of Europe under Nazi German, Italian, and Japanese imperialism, the very legitimacy of British colonial rule is now left in question. With the British now broke and desperate in its use of violence to squash expressions for self-rule in its colonies, these men become known by the public as the Big Six. What cannot readily be seen in this picture is a fundamental crack between them. The 5 founding members on one side and Kwame Nkrumah on the other, about exactly what independence represents. Nkrumah does not believe that any oppressor would willfully release their stranglehold on any colony. That in spite of the propaganda hammered home by the missionaries through Christian schools and the British government's arguments that a relationship is meant to usher what they see as backward societies into Western modernity, colonialism is exclusively about exploiting the colony and all its resources for the benefit of Britain. Any development that arises in education and infrastructure is exclusively meant to facilitate the removal of that colony's natural resources. Nkrumah believes that only direct popular action, disruptive and persistent enough to make the African ungovernable under a United Kingdom bankrupted by World War II, would force the issue of self-government. The other 5 in the Big Six are more about correspondence with the colonial government, negotiating with them and coming to an agreement amicably. This fundamental difference in view comes to a head once the 6 are incarcerated following the riots. In prison, the 5 blame Nkrumah for the boycott and its potential connection to the riots. In fact, on release, the UGCC demotes Kwame Nkrumah. On hearing this, the youth wing of the UGCC presses Kwame Nkrumah to break away from the organization and form his own party. The disturbances also gave leverage to the Labour Party in Britain over the conservative establishment, and they too pushed for greater African inclusion into governance. Under pressure, the colonial government forms the All-African Kuse Committee to prepare a report on how the country should be run. They invite 5 of the Big Six to join, all except for Kwame Nkrumah himself, who the British see as a troublemaker. The British prefer to share power with this group of moderate, educated elites who would ensure British colonial influence is maintained. With the committee still preparing its report, Kwame Nkrumah leads a massive breakaway movement from the UGCC. His new party is called the Convention People's Party, or CPP. In 1951, Kwame Nkrumah declares positive action, what is planned to be widespread peaceful protest and boycotts across the colony in order to bring the country to a halt and speed up the issue of independence.
Positive action, the goals of for independence now, and we link it with India, because India staged positive action during the time of Gandhi, and they achieved independence. So we said we wanted to declare positive action. All our supporters should stay out of work so that the British government will know what our demands are. And we warn them that nobody should act violently. It must all be without violence.
While it is meant to have been entirely peaceful, the scale of it means clashes cannot be avoided. 2 policemen are killed. The British response is to round up all the ringleaders. Nkrumah is incarcerated at James Fort, located at Jamestown in Accra. With under 6 months in the first election, the British expect the UGCC to have a clear run to victory. This would mean the partially African government will consist exclusively of moderate intellectual Africans the British can work with, rather than the uncompromising nationalist CPP. By a fortunate coincidence, just as Nkrumah is entering prison, one of his lieutenants, Komla Gbedema, is being released after 6 months behind bars. He immediately begins repairing the party that had been devastated by the arrest of much of his leadership following positive action. In February 1951, the elections are called. and Gbedema organizes the CPP campaign. The manner in which these campaigns are organized makes all the difference. Unlike the UGCC, whose intellectual elites cannot bring themselves to mingle too directly with the masses, Nkrumah's CPP do just that. Their grassroots members become known as the Veranda Boys.
They were prepared to sleep on verandas with the boys, popularly called Veranda Boys, because most of them were sleeping in verandas at the time. And when they went out to the villages, they trucked down together, sang their songs, drank palm wine in street bars, street corners with them, and virtually were prepared to throw their lot in with them at all times, at all places. Now this, Dankwa and others were not prepared to do. No, indeed, would they have been proved honest if they had attempted to do it, because it just didn't suit them. It wasn't in their character, it wasn't in their makeup, and they could not pretend to be with them in those directions without exposing their own hypocrisy.
And their leaders are willing to sleep on the verandas with them, drink palm wines with them, sing songs to motivate them in solidarity everywhere they go. The public response to this is electrifying. In spite of still being behind bars, Nkrumah wins the 1951 election against his former UGCC colleagues, and the colonial government has the embarrassing task of releasing the leader of the newly formed, partially African government from prison. There is surprisingly good harmony between the Africans and the British members of government. With a booming economy in cocoa, the CPP passes on the benefits by making free-for-all primary school education, doubling the school population within 3 years. Healthcare is rapidly extended across the colony, and a house building program is launched. Roads and harbour constructions begin in earnest. Within 3 years, the CPP has shown the British that Africans can run their own affairs. By 1954, the second Gold Coast election is announced.
The 51 election was just to establish the government. Now, several discussions took place after that regarding the granting of independence. And it was agreed with the British government that if we won the 54 elections, independence would follow.
Several conservative oppositions form, united only in their shared distrust of the CPP.
CPP was a bit corrupt at that time, and money was all. And if you didn't belong to it, you were not given any share of whatever was happening in the country. So we kicked against it. My campaigning was more or less on moral issues, because at that time, the youth were up against the elders and the chiefs of the country. And as a woman, we didn't like it that way at all, because in our tradition, we respected our elders and especially our chiefs.
Despite this, the CPP wins 2/3 of the seats in government. Independence now seems inevitable. However, soon after that election, the Asante chiefs and cocoa farmers launched the National Liberation Movement. It seeks to keep the massive wealth of the Asantes from the national agenda. They push the issue of a federal system of government that they believe would secure their wealth, power, and traditions from an African central government in Accra. The chiefs of the Northern Territories also share the notion that the best form of government is a federal one. The Northern Territories are the least developed parts of the Gold Coast, and they do not trust the leadership of black men in the South. They believe the British would do a better job in developing their region than a government of fellow Africans.
So we sent a delegation to Bridging, and I spoke for the Northern Territories. And I told them that when the chiefs of the Northern Territories entered into treaties for protection with the British Crown, they understood it to mean not only protection from internal and external threats, but also a responsibility on the part of the British Crown to lead the people, to stand on their feet and be able to manage their own affairs. Now, we felt Britain had not honorably played her part and that aspect. And I told them that, well, when the first British men came to our place, they told our fathers to look to them and that they were going to lead them step by step into a prosperous and happy country. And they believed them and felt the white man never lied. I used that expression. I said, they believed the white man never lied, but it appears you are going back on your word, which means you are not going to lie to them to use that word. So I thought Britain had a moral obligation, to help us out of our present difficulty.
The very day we are inaugurating NLM, they started stone throwing. They even sent people on the way. When the people are coming to a rally, they told them that the rally didn't go on, so they must return. And few people who came, they stoned their cars. And even when we were in the rally, they stoned us with the bottles and stones, while the police were standing unconcerned. But as we were determined to deliver Ashanti and part of the country from Nkrumah, we were also determined. I've told them that I don't want you to be violent, but when anybody attack you, try to defend yourself.
Clashes break out between strong armed gangs of the Asante arm of the NLM and the CPP, known as Action Groupers and Action Troopers. Today, we call such groups vigilante groups. Their goal is to intimidate the other side. Eventually, violence breaks out and the intimidation turns to actual killing. Even the colonial governor was seen with suspicion, and his motorcade is stoned by members of the NLM in Kumasi, who believe he has become the mouthpiece for Nkrumah's central government. A bomb is set underneath CPP party headquarters.
There was a very strong smell coming up from below, and I thought at the time, it's a bit off to think this is the Prime Minister's residence, all this dreadful, you can't even sort of sit and chat without this dreadful noise and the awful smells coming up. And suddenly a terrific lot of smoke came up, sort of, yellowy, grey smoke, with a very strong smell of, what I said, it smells like fireworks. And as soon as I said this, two of these chaps said, "My God, fireworks," and jumped up and went downstairs, and they'd hardly got to the bottom of the steps when this terrific explosion happened. And there was a dreadful shattering of glass, and all this sort of thing. But miraculously, nobody was hurt.
Unfortunately, between 1956 and 1966, this would only be the first of many attempts made on Nkrumah's life, meant to put an end to his national agenda. And in successive attempts, innocent lives would be lost. The existence of violence leads the colonial government to postpone the declaration of independence until a referendum is organized to settle the issue between the major parties. Will the Gold Coast become a nation state, as the CPP wants, or a federal state, as the NLM proposes?
Now, we had gone to London to try and convince the Secretary of State that it was not fair to us, having fought an election in '54, barely 2 years later, to have to fight a second election before independence. When we arrived, we found Lennox Boyd absolutely unyielding. And he disarmed us by saying, "Look, gentlemen, Mr. Botsio, Mr. Gbedema, if I must put the Ghana Gold Coast Independence Act before Parliament, they must be prepared to back me. I can't go and have it rejected. And their condition is that they would like to hand over to the majority party in the country." And reports they had been having were to the effect that the CPP had lost its majority. We tried to convince him that this was not true, but he would not yield.
Whoever wins the referendum would be given a chance to form the government, NLM or the CPP. The NLM puts up a lively campaign, but lose. With a CPP victory in 1956, the NLM refuses to take their seats in the Legislative Assembly or even discuss independence.
Our argument was that we had carried overwhelmingly the northern region, we had carried overwhelmingly the Ashanti region, we had shared the honors equally with the CPP in the Transvolta Trust Territory, and that the only areas where they had won decisively were the two eastern and western regions. We also pointed out at the time that whereas it took about 7,000 to 8,000 votes to win a seat in Ashanti or the north, you only needed between 2,000 and 3,000 votes to win a seat in one of the eastern or western provinces. So we were claiming then that out of the 5 regions, since we had effectively carried 2 and shared the honors with the CPP in the 3rd, there was a strong case for a federal constitution.
But the CPP had won 57% of the votes and more than 2/3 of the seats. The British government rejected the federal argument. From all over the region, Ashantis travelled to Kumasi to make their strength of feeling known to him.
We were greeted by a crowd of, I don't know, 10,000, many thousand Ashanti, chanting and bearing banners, some of them dressed in brown, the colour of mourning, the banners saying things like, "British don't go, we don't want independence," 5 weeks before the declared date for independence. And there was a great deal of noise and shouting and display, but not, in fact, any misbehaviour, I don't think.
And I think Lennox Boyd was very impressed with the courtesy, the genuineness, the strength of appeal of the Ashanti Hini, who loved his people and really was their king. And I think Lennox Boyd wanted to do what he could to help the Ashantis. In other words, just like myself and the other administrative officers in Ashanti, we wanted to help the Ashantis. Naturally, we wanted to see independence coming, but we did want to see some safeguards for the Ashanti.
Well, the constitution which has been laid before Parliament is not different in any way from either the constitution of Canada, Australia, or Ceylon. There have been a few clauses put in to make provision for our particular circumstances in the Gold Coast.
If we accepted any ideas about regionalism at all, it was just a sop to get independence brought to us or given to us. But we never really intended to divide the country up, what they had failed to achieve, to do it for them. Some of the ideas had to be washed away.
With a nation-state now a firm idea, Nkrumah pushes for a ban on parties that are based primarily on ethnicity or religion. The NLM quickly reorganizes itself into the United Party and would remain the key opposition until 1964, when another referendum changes the constitution to a single-party state.
The crowds were milling on what is now, well, it was the old Polo Ground. There were thousands of people there waiting anxiously for the results. At about soon after midnight, the final results were known, and the CPP had won by a large majority. And the late Mr. Salloway, who was then the Chief Secretary, called me and said, "Mr. Gidima, you must tell your people." So I, quite unprepared, I stood up and I said, "Now, at long last, the people of this country have spoken the language which the imperialists understand, the language of the ballot box. We have won this election." And the roars which came from the thousands still rings in my ears.
On September 18th, 1956, Nkrumah announces that independence will take place in 6 months. The date chosen is the very same date on which 100 years earlier, Fanti chiefs signed the Bond of 1844 with the British, the very first step in the British colony in the Gold Coast. The country would be named after a former empire that existed north of the Northern Territories, from which the first settlers in the Gold Coast are believed to have migrated from, the Ghana Empire. The name Ghana means warrior king, an apt title for what her leaders believe would someday be a continent-wide struggle for full independence and unity of the entire African continent. By 6th March 1957, there is so much confidence and so much to look forward to for the new nation. From all across the world, black activists came to see and be inspired in their own freedom struggles. the Black Star Nation would become a beacon for a ripple effect that would see one African nation after the other break free of colonial rule.
This decade is the decade of African independence.
Each would engage with their own bitter struggle, both with the colonial government unwilling to let go of their cash cow, and in violent disagreement, sometimes fatally, with an opposition unwilling to see a world beyond European dominance. It took 9 long years to finally achieve full independence in Ghana. From that fateful day on 28 February 1948 at the Crossroad, to Nkrumah and his CPP leadership on the podium at the Polo Court. By 1957, the first victory has been won. The struggle for true and full independence is only just beginning. Kwame Nkrumah and his generation pass on. Their contribution will forever be in the annals of African history. The road after them is long and tortuous, and there will be so many casualties in the struggle for African liberation, including Kwame Nkrumah himself. Even today, our independence struggle continues.
Forward then to independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Encouraged by some of our friends in England to watch the people he called reactionaries. And actually, talking to him, I got the impression that he was not going to be with us for long, for he regarded most of us as being reactionary.